Governor Mike Huckabee and your calls at 855-840-HUCK. That's 855-840-4825.
Welcome back to the Mike Huckabee Show. I think most of us would assume that the one maybe part of America that is very supportive of all of our basic rights would be the military, and generally that has been true, and certainly historically. You might be shocked to find out that one organization that seems to be increasingly hostile toward freedom of religion has become the U.S. military, and specifically the United States Air Force. One congressman is not just walking away and letting it go, and thank God for that. He's here with us today in studio, Congressman Randy Forbes of the 4th District of Virginia. Congressman, it's good to have you back on the Mike Huckabee Show, but especially to talk about something that I know you're passionate about, the loss of religious freedom in our military.
Well, Governor, it's huge, and we've seen that over the last few years, and we chair the Congressional Prayer Caucus, which is a bipartisan group that's committed to fighting for religious freedom and religious liberty across the country. And it's particularly shocking when we see what's happening to our military today.
What are some of the examples where you feel like that religious freedom is under assault by the military?
Well, let me give you several of them. First of all, in the Navy issued a memorandum that actually prohibited Bibles from being brought into naval hospitals, even if they were brought by a member of the clergy, even if requested by a patient. The Air Force has literally ruled that the word God can't be used in the Air Force. They made them take it off of a patch, even though they acknowledged that it wasn't used in a religious context. The Air Force has now told their officers they cannot inform members of the Air Force about programs, even if they're valid, acceptable programs, that the chaplains have that could benefit those particular servicemen. Has to be told only by the chaplains. They have done away with any kind of ethics courses that in any way reference any biblical quotes or any biblical passages at all. And, of course, you remember the young cadet that was chastised because he dared to ask other of his colleagues to simply contribute to a program for needy children at Christmas because that program had a faith-based component. And today, literally, we've been talking about this at several places today. I had an email that came in just moments ago while I was waiting to come in and talk with you about a mother that said that her son, serving in the Air Force now in New Mexico, he had a program that was a graduation program out there, and he asked them not to say God bless him at the program, not to reference God, because he was afraid of the retribution that would come on him from some of his superior officers, and that he will not go to church out there now because he's afraid of that kind of pushback. You know, Mike, that's just a terrible, chilling effect, and it is something that you and I would have never thought 20 years ago we'd ever see in this country.
Congressman Randy Forbes is my guest. We're talking about the loss of religious freedom, specifically in the military. When you say that the Navy couldn't distribute a Bible, even a chaplain, who made that order? Who set down that policy and said, yeah, we're going to change common sense?
Yeah. Obviously, it was some officers in the Navy. We were ultimately able to meet with two admirals that were higher up than them, and in so many of these issues, if we can just put transparency on it, they will back off, and they did in that particular situation. But many of these other ones in the Air Force, they've been reluctant to do it. So we just had a letter that was signed by 66 members of Congress, but more importantly, 6 of the 7 subcommittee chairmen for the Armed Services Committee asking Secretary Panetta to give us an explanation of why they're taking these courses of action.
Have you had a response yet from the Secretary?
We've had no response yet from the Secretary, but we're going to continue with this, and hopefully we're going to get it. And if we don't, we will get him when he comes over to testify on some other issue before the Armed Services Committee.
You know, it really is, to me, beyond description. I can understand if they said you cannot force, an airman or a sailor to sit through a church service against his will. You can't make them go to a chapel service. I get that. But that's not what you're talking about. You're talking about people who want to voluntarily express themselves. You know, here we are at a point where we have to accept same-sex relationships in the military. We're supposed to just say that's fine. And now we have the first same-sex wedding on a military installation. That seems to be okay, but you can't have a prayer or a Christmas program and can't give out Bibles. I'm just bewildered by that.
You know, Mike, it's just absolutely outrageous to see where they've gone and what they're doing. And again, these are the cases we're catching. But you can imagine the chilling effect. If you're someone that's looking out for a career in the military and you know these things are happening, then you're just like this young man that this mother just wrote me about. You're very, very concerned to talk about your faith or to do anything that would exhibit your faith, afraid it's going to hurt your career.
Congressman, I'd like to believe this is not a partisan issue. I want to believe, and I hope you can tell me, that there are some faith-based Democrats who are equally offended by this.
I can absolutely say that. We have our Congressional Prayer Caucus is a bipartisan group, and it is Republicans and Democrats that are coming together to fight this issue. And it's just something we've seen from this administration more, and it seems to be growing. And, of course, as you know, it's outside the military as well. We saw a bank in Oklahoma that they were threatening to take action against them by the Federal Reserve because they just had one little table that said Merry Christmas on it. And we had to actually force the Federal Reserve to come in and say, what in the world are you doing? We saw a pastor, an athletic director in Florida, you probably remember in Pensacola, Florida, that threatened to take them to jail for 6 months. Give them a $5,000 fine and take away their retirement. Their big sin, Mike, was that the principal asked the athletic director to offer a prayer at a booster club off school property, 16 seconds, and a federal judge was trying to take them into court for that.
Yeah, it's not far from where I live down in Florida and over in Santa Rosa County. Mm-hmm. You know, I was shocked by that, and I think the whole country was. You read this stuff and you think, either there's something we didn't read right or the press didn't get it right. Sadly, that's exactly what's happening.
Well, Mike, the big thing is that last part you said the press didn't get it right. Except for shows like this, press doesn't cover much of this. They keep it very quiet, and that's why the average person around there doesn't know what's really happening on the attacks on faith and what we're seeing eroding. You know, you were correct in saying we don't want to push faith on anybody in this country. We just want to have faith have a seat at the table in the marketplace of ideas, which it's had since this country was founded. And we're getting to the point now where you can't even talk about history anywhere because of these kinds of efforts that are taking place.
Congressman, I've read the prayers of Franklin Delano Roosevelt during World War II. And when I say the prayers, I'm not talking about the private prayers that he wrote and kept in a journal. Franklin Delano Roosevelt went on radio nationally and prayed eloquently.
I think it was about 6.5 minutes long. It was not a short prayer.
It was not a short prayer. It was the kind that if you were doing that before a meal, you would have elbows in your ribs for, come on, man, we're hungry. That kind of prayer. Nobody thought that it was inappropriate for the President of the United States to openly pray. You had presidents and members of Congress, and it was considered a normal part of the American culture. What has happened to us to get us so far from where we have been historically? And I think that's my point here, is that this is not, we're not in trying to recover something by being anti-religious. Being anti-religious is very un-American, very unlike who we were for the first 200 and something years of our history.
Well, you know, I think what a lot of people don't realize is some of these anti-faith, and these are anti-faith groups. It's not just being an atheist or an agnostic. These are anti-faith groups, raise a lot of money, and they were attacking in just the courts because it's hard to defend against a particular judge in some venue that they could have a venue selection process. But now they're going after legislatures, they're going after staffing and people, and what we've seen is one of the places they're going is even in local school boards and city councils and trying to stop prayers from taking place before those organizations begin their meeting, as we do in Congress. So we're trying to strategize and say, okay, let's go back and make sure we're not just staying on the defense. How do we take the offense? Let me just give you one perfect example.
Great.
We've had many of these organizations try to file suits against city council because they couldn't start with a prayer. And as you know, the law is drafted against them. If they lose, they've got to pay the other side's legal fee. So we came out with this recommendation to them. As you mentioned, we've got so much great history in there. I've literally pulled every prayer that was ever offered in the Senate or the House and in the congressional record. I'm going through hundreds of prayers now and putting them in a package to send out to city council. Here's what we're telling them to do. If they want to stop you from having a prayer, then one thing they can't stop you from doing is putting the national motto up behind you. So put in God we trust, step behind you so they get to see it the whole session. But then do this. Start your meeting by saying, Mr. Chairman, and you'll be recognized, and then say, I'd like to put in the record the fact that on March 8th, 1948, in the Senate of the United States, the following was said. Read that prayer and say, this is a part of the congressional record of the United States. I'd like to submit it as part of our record. There's more than one way to attack this, Mike, and we just have to go on the offense and start doing those things.
See, that's so creative, and it's incredibly thoughtful, I think, and innovative to say, we're not going to just sit back. Here's the big question. Congressman Randy Forbes is my guest. I want to make sure everybody knows who I'm talking to, because I want you to know Congressman Forbes and pray for him. He needs the strength of your prayers. But here's the question. What can people do? I mean, we get outraged when we hear this stuff, but I don't want people just to drive on where they're going and say, oh, that's terrible. I want them to do something about it today. What can they do?
Well, one thing they can do is call their members of Congress and say, have you signed on to this letter about the Air Force and about what's happening into the Department of Defense? We've literally had hundreds of individuals calling across the country today to their members of Congress saying, how come you're not on that letter? That's one. Second thing, Mike, is we can't keep being on the defense. That's why we formed the Congressional Prayer Caucus, to draw a line in the sand and say these rights are worth fighting for. We now have over 100 members. It's one of the largest caucuses in Congress, but we're creating them. We have a foundation. It's the Congressional Prayer Caucus Foundation that's literally setting these up in state legislatures around the country so that they can offensively begin to defend religious liberty and religious freedom. And one of the things that your listeners can do is say, how do we create one of these in our state legislature so we're not sitting back and waking up to a point where we're passing on a nation to our children and our grandchildren where they will not feel they have the freedom to simply stand up for their faith.
Congressman Randy Forbes, my guest. We've talked about how the shutdown has come to people who exhibit Christian faith. Is the same type of prohibition being applied to Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, and others? Is it universal?
We don't see it being universally applied. What we have seen is, if you remember back a couple of years ago, they tried to go after the chaplains in the military, and literally they were censoring their prayers. At that particular time, we actually had Jewish chaplains, Muslim chaplains, and Christian chaplains all coming to us saying, thank you for fighting for our religious freedom. And we did fight for all of their freedoms. But on most of these chilling effects that we're talking about with the Air Force, every action so far that's been reported to us has been addressed against Christians.
It is just remarkable, and I cannot tell you how much I appreciate your being here today to talk about it, and I hope that people will do exactly what you suggested. Contact their member of Congress, contact the U.S. Senator, and say, are you signing on to this letter? And I assume the members of Congress will know what letter they're talking about.
Absolutely. Just say the letter to the Air Force that's set out by the Congressional Prayer Caucus, and they'll know. And, Mike, the key thing for people, we've got to make a decision. We're going to go quietly into the night and give up our religious freedoms, or are we going to stand up and make sure that we're doing what our forefathers did, and that's being willing to stand for them?
Well, I'm not going quietly in the night, and I'm grateful you're in Congress because I know you're not. And it's great to see you again. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having us.
Congressman Randy Forbes, 4th District of Virginia.